Hello and good morning friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today we are going to carry our series forward on Indian writing in English translation, and today we would be talking on Kabir. We would be discussing Kabir as a poet and a phenomenon. And for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English from University of Delhi. Professor Prakash keep us enlightening, and his enlightenment helps us to find a new path, a better way towards the life. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Professor Prakash on today's topic, then you can call right in the CEC studio. You can contact us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. So let's welcome our guest Professor Prakash, and let's try to have a deep insight into today's topic. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, and welcome viewers. And today's discussion is on Kabir, poet and phenomenon. And we've had discussions on other occasions also on this poet, but today the particular thing is that he is available in English translation, and for that reason people in India, apart from North India where Hindi is the medium of instruction and education, and people follow it, and the rest of India where there is a medium that is helpful in knowing what was written in North India in the Hindi language. So keeping that in mind, and also the world audience, there has been a lot of work done on Kabir, particularly from the view of presenting it for the reader and viewer today. So in English translation, so we'll be discussing Kabir now from that angle, and the angle also has this thing in its consciousness, that Kabir is to be known as a person, as a poet, who's new to most of the people at which this discussion is directed. So let's be a bit simple with respect to the approach to Kabir in this discussion, but it doesn't mean that we'll be diluting the subject or the concerns that Kabir represented, Kabir shared with the rest of the people in his time. So let's look at Kabir from this angle, that he's available for the non-Hindi speaking audience in the country and outside. And we begin by saying that Kabir, who is a poet of the medieval period in India, who was, once again there is an issue regarding when he was born, where he was born, what his education was, and all those things. And a lot of work has now been done in the last 100 years or so. People have taken up the subject of Kabir's time, the subject of Kabir's dates, the subject of Kabir's actual physical existence. And for that reason, the final, the verdict, sort of, it's a working verdict, is that Kabir now can be, dated, can be mentioned in terms of the dates that belong to him, much more precisely than before. Not that the issue has been settled, but definitely we know more about, the study that has happened in the meantime, fixing Kabir somewhere in history and historical period. So the final thing that I was looking at before I thought of coming here and talking to you was that Kabir was in India between 1398 and 1444. So which means that he was there for 50 years. He lived for 50 years. And this goes against, and this is at variance with the other dates that false scholars have been telling us earlier. In fact, those who worship Kabir, which is a contradiction in terms, we didn't believe in worship. Those who worship Kabir, those who believe in him, those who are his followers, those who are called Kabir Panthis, these people believe that Kabir lived for 120 years. Now, a lot of faith might have gone into it, and it's a kind of compliment that people give to him, that he lived long and he was there to shed light on various topics. But then others have worked on the basis of the theoretical intellectual tools that they have today at their command, and they tell us that Kabir's dates would be more precise than what has been said already, and that the latest date would be 1398 and 1448. To which aspects of life did this period belong? This is pre-Mughal period, all of us know, and this belongs to the early medieval period in India, when this country was a country of peasantry. This country was a country of artisans, where barring one or two big towns, there were generally small towns, where all the talent, all the energy, all the current of life emanated from the village life, and from there it traveled through small towns to the big cities. And Kabir's association with the big city was that way with Banaras, Varanasi, or Kashi. And this word Kashi comes again and again. It is mentioned in Kabir's poetry. And the other place that is associated with Kabir is Magad or Maghar. This is an area, now people have been able to spot this area also, that he was there in Basti also for a large number of years, particularly towards the end. So two places are associated with him, Basti near Gorakhpur, and Banaras or Varanasi, which is at the heart of North India. So these two places are there, and people have examined his language, his usage, the message, the peculiar message that is contained in the language, and there are other things, and on that basis they say that, well, these are the two places, and this is where he spent his time, and secondly, that he was there in this period. So anyway, let's assume it as a working kind of information for us, because our purpose is not merely to do research on or read research on this aspect, but to understand what Kabir stood for, and that's why this topic has been poet and phenomenon. So he's a great poet, a poet who entertains, a poet who enlightens, a poet who soothes the nerves of the people who read him or hear him, and he's also a phenomenon. His appeal is so vast, so wide, and he affects, influences, inspires people, and he tells them, he gives them interpretation, he gives them a view, he gives them a vision, and in light of that, people examine their own conduct, their own behavior, they become critical about themselves, and they might think of improving them, of learning their lessons from what Kabir said. So this person, Kabir, then is a poet, of course, and he is a phenomenon. He is a person with a vast appeal, at that point of time, and people sing his verses all across the country. I'll come to this later, but first let me tell you a few things about the Indian mystic tradition to which he belongs. Indian mystic tradition, mysticism, and it's a big aspect on its own. What is mysticism? Please think about it. Mystic word has some connection with mystery, some kind of ignorance, some kind of wonder. We don't know. The thing is not clear before us, but we keep thinking about what might be there. And when you keep thinking about it, then the essential purpose and function of your behavior, behind your behavior, is that of understanding and thinking, thought. So people think, they use their intellect to understand what is happening around them. And since they don't have any answers at that time, nor do they have answers to many things even today, so they start wondering as to where things come from, where they are made, where they are formed. And if they are made and formed there and one doesn't know about them, then of course they go into a kind of trance. They start thinking, and this thinking, tells them, gives them a kind of feeling, and that feeling is of not exactly the kind that we have in life, like satiation of hunger, happiness, etc., but that people start wondering as to what went on at that time, and this means that people take away from their immediate life. So you use your other senses other than the five senses that we have. You start thinking, things happen in your mind. You start taking in, information from various sources, and you put them in your head, and there the head starts processing the information and reaching certain conclusions. And since conclusions are difficult to reach, people are not educated and they are not well read at that time. So then people just wonder. They are surprised. They go into a trance and they say there is something, but I don't know what it is. And if you have the feeling that there is something, you don't know about it, then that thing starts haunting you, haunting me. I feel obsessed by what may be there and which I don't know. So this knowing, not knowing, this shuffling from one state of mind to another, and then in this journey back and forth, this creates some kind of a sensation in us, and that sensation, that feeling, that sense of curiosity, all these things combine to have some kind of a mystical idea about life. So this is what mysticism is, and I explain it this way because in medieval period there may have been certain sources from elsewhere. Maybe that they were there in the soil of India itself. India has a long tradition of mysticism on its own. When scholars discuss, they use discourse, and they come up with some abstract issue, and they cannot explain what it is, and then they together or individually they study that phenomena with observation. All these things are quite common in the Indian context. And in the medieval period, when poets started feeling this kind of sense of surprise, then it might have given a rise to what I call mysticism. So the point that I make with respect to mysticism, which will directly apply to Kabir, is that mysticism is thought oriented. There is feeling in it, no doubt. Without feeling, human beings don't exist. Even when you think, you feel. But then there is a difference between what thinking is and what feeling is. And if the predominant presence is of thinking in one's conduct, in one's practice, then one can say that one is moving towards mysticism. So it is thought oriented, which means that Kabir will not look around the world and start feeling happy or unhappy, and just like that, and he'll express his opinion, or that he will observe certain rules and principles of life because that's what the forefathers did, that's what his parents might have done, that's what his neighbors do all the time, and therefore he follows them. That is not the case, because he does not just adopt things from the circumstances in which he lives, but he just looks at the circumstances critically. So which means that if medieval India is known by its rituals, its traditions, its principles and rules, and there are certain practices which are a part of routine, then that's one kind of thing. And if a person doesn't follow the routine, looks at the routine skeptically, tries to find out whether the routine is useful or of no use. If a person starts doing that, and then also raises the question in one's own talk with his friends, with his neighbors, with his enemies, when one disagrees, one says no, what you say is wrong and what I say is right, or that so far I've been thinking wrong and now I'll think right. If you start thinking like this, if I start thinking like this, then I would say that the conduct is thought oriented. And this kind of practice of thinking about things around oneself, this must have been quite common in Kabir's time. When Kabir is born in 1398, and let's say that Kabir is a young man in the 1410s and 1420s, at that time he looks around and he disbelieves and he questions and he interrogates and he disagrees. So these are the things that make this person Kabir. And therefore I would say that mystic tradition has at its center what can be called thought. So you think. The second thing is that the sensuous and the ritualistic. Sensuous is a positive word. You perceive things with your senses, and then you accept those perceptions, and then you start enjoying those perceptions, and you express them in poetry. So that's a different kind of poetry, and it elevates other people. It gives pleasure to other people. That's what sensuousness is. But then, in this case, when the person is thinking, sensuousness is on the sides. It is in the background. It might come, it might not come. But then ideas come. And if you extend the scope of senses and they say that anger also is a sensation, then of course, Kabir is a very sensuous poet because he's quite angry with what he perceives around him, and he feels that what he sees around him stifles him, blocks him, puts obstacles in his way, and his job then to sort out those things and overcome them. This is what Kabir is. And imagine that we perhaps don't follow Kabir's principles today as much as Kabir himself did at that time. And Kabir was not educated. Kabir he was not born in even a middle class family. There were no middle classes then, but he must have been one of the poorest of the poor. And yet this person at that point of time started disbelieving, unbelieving, and he started questioning. So this is what he does, and his criticism is of the ritual, and this ritual is the staple of North India at that point of time. There is a caste system, and certain people believe not just in rituals, but they observe rituals, they practice rituals, and they think that through rituals they can attain the height of consciousness and things like that. And Kabir stands in front of them and says, no, this is not possible. You tell me how through rituals one can attain happiness, one can attain enlightenment, or one can attain a kind of connect with higher senses, higher sense, higher form. And if somebody says, well, this is Bhagwan or this is Ram, then Kabir would like to find out what is Ram and what is Bhagwan and what is my Bhagwan, and so he'll start thinking about it. So mystics have this idea that whatever you tell them, they will examine it. They will then allow this to enter their head, and then they will examine things from their own perspective, and if they find it right, then they say it is right. So in a way, the mystic tradition is based on a truthful observation and examination of the phenomena around their time. So Kabir is that kind of a poet. He's a mystic poet, he's a thought-oriented poet. You read Kabir and you start thinking about what his concerns were at that time and what our concerns are in our time. So see the kind of inspiration and the kind of connect that Kabir can establish with us today. If I read Kabir, then I start looking around myself, and I'm skeptic about how things happen today and how people start believing in all those things that they have not examined properly. So my father, my grandfather, my neighbor, my teacher, and others whom I revere, whom I admire, these people say, and I accept them uncritically, whatever they say. This is not true. If one is a mystic, if one is like Kabir, if one has taken one's inspiration from Kabir, then one would say, okay, maybe the other person is right, but I would like to examine. This is important. So mysticism teaches us also today to take away from the immediate sensuous experience and to go into the realm of the field of thinking, the field of analyzing, the field of interpreting in our own manner. So that is what Kabir holds his appeal for. So he is against rituals, he is against institutions. This is important. And if one goes into his life, I'll maybe in the middle somewhere, I will just touch upon his individual life also. But then he is against institutions. What are the institutions? In his time, the institution was of marriage. The institution was of following the practice of one's own work and whatever one was told by others. So in the early phase of life, this is what you're supposed to do. In the middle phase of life, there is another kind of conduct. In the last phase of life, there is a third kind of conduct. All these things were laid down quite clearly by the supposed scriptures at that time. And people said, okay, do this. Now you are a young boy, so you just move in one way, then you become an adult, then marry. Once you are married, then rear children. After that, children grow up. Therefore, you start detaching from this, from the marriage things, and later you leave this world and leave the social world and go to the forest and become sannyas. So these were the stages that were totally set for the individual in one's own life. So Kabir would not accept it. Kabir would say, I would like to find out whether these stages are right or wrong. If somebody tells him, as I already indicated, somebody tells that there is a God and one should worship, then he would say, why should I worship? I would like to know And if God is there, I would like to find out what He expects from me, and I'll do that. So he doesn't like religion, he doesn't like family, he doesn't like even the other social structures like administration, like the sarkar, like the government of the day. He would definitely look critically even at the king at that time. The king has an authority, but who gave that authority to him? And somebody would say, okay, God gave that authority to the king. Then he would say, okay, I would ask my God. I would find out whether there is God. If there is a God, then I will find out whether that God gave authority to the king or not. So, these social institutions, political institutions, faith-oriented institutions, all of them will come under scrutiny so far as Kabir is concerned. You can read his poetry, you will find that this is the case. And then, not just institutions, but structures. Now, structure is a new word. The structure is not there, let's say, 50 or 100 years ago in the Indian critical tradition. But today we talk about structures. Structures mean there are certain bindings. Institutions, fine. Institution is a kind of set of practices. But those practices are based on structures. Structures means certain things, which are not visible directly, but which work as rules and principles. And these rules and principles are not breakable or are breakable with difficulty because they bind us. They are threads, they are strings, and therefore they are structures. In the building, for instance, the structure is the pillars. One doesn't see the pillars in the building except in the in the front, but there are pillars within the walls, and there is a kind of structure beneath the earth, and we don't see it, but the structure is there. The same way, the institutions are there for us to see, but the structures behind the institutions are not seen. And Kabir, the thinker, then goes into the very structures and examines them and talks about them in his poetry. I say in his poetry, I say Kabir is a poet, but I have not so far told how he is a poet. And you can ask this question from me, you can ask this question from yourselves. How do we call Kabir a poet if he is a thinker? A thinker is not a poet. A thinker is, analyzes and interprets and explains. That's the question that I should like to face, and you also like to face. How is Kabir a poet then? He is all the time telling us. Poet doesn't tell, poet shares, but Kabir is telling us. And then I say that one should read his poems, short poems or long poems. His long poems are also not very long, just 10, 15 lines, and the short poems are 2 lines. And the short poems are called couplets, and long poems are called songs. So he has written only couplets and songs, dohas and sabads, and that's what Kabir is. But his dohas are innumerable. You can't count them. You can't keep count on them. And his songs are also innumerable. You can't count them again. Why I say that you can't count? Because that works under the phenomena. Kabir is a phenomena. So some people believe so much in him. They feel so inspired by him that in the process of believing in him, they start thinking like him, and they start composing their own poems. But they know that they compose those poems under the influence of Kabir's inspiration. Therefore, they say, it's not me who has written the poem, Kabir has written the poem. And Kabir, has a signature statement in most of his longer poems, that is his songs. And the last line would be, Kahe Kabir, says Kabir. This is what is the case. So the follower also starts thinking like Kabir, composing like Kabir, and at the end doesn't give his own name, says Kahe Kabir, which means if people start writing like this, and they are from different parts of India, and they come from different periods, not just in his own period in the 14th century, but 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, and even today. If they believe that this is what is right, and Kabir has told me this in my dreams or in my imagination, then I would like to ascribe all that I say to Kabir's name. So how many poems and how many dohas and all would be there today in the name of Kabir? The answer is you can't count them. There are so many. And that's why it's difficult for us today, after so many centuries of the practice that I mentioned, to say that this is what Kabir wrote, and these are the poems that are exactly his. So Kabir is a poet because while he expresses an idea, he uses certain poetic techniques. For instance, he uses comparisons. He uses metaphors. Though those metaphors don't come easy to a thinker. A thinker would like to all the time divide things into different parts. and then take each part and explain, and then one would reach the conclusion. That's what the thinker does. Or explain, if you ask a question, they say, okay, I'll explain. And then it starts like this, it grows like this, finally it comes to an end like this. But Kabir doesn't follow this. He makes a statement, and in the process of making the statement, he uses metaphors. For instance, he says, my body is like a sheet. And if the body becomes a sheet, then you start thinking about the body, and you start thinking about the sheet. And body is not a sheet, and sheet is not a body. So this is the poetic part. This is the moment he thinks of sheet, of the chadar, and when he talks about the chadar, he talks of the sheet, and the sheet can be soiled, the sheet can be disfigured. It can be it can lose its color, its shine, and it becomes weak. The threads are seen, and the sheet might be torn any time. So what is he talking about? This is a poetic thing, that you are talking about life and you are using a metaphor. So Kabir uses this metaphor, and sometimes these metaphors are so powerful that you start enjoying them. You forget about his ideas, but you start enjoying those metaphors, and that's what makes him a poet. So I'll just go like this, talking about Kabir, and in the process I'm sure that different questions will emerge, and I will be able to acquaint you with what I feel about Kabir as a poet and as a phenomena. So in the next part of discussion, I will take these things up. Thank you. Well, so far, friends, we have talked about initially Kabir as a poet, but we can take some examples from this. The kind of words, the kind of pictures, the kind of figures of speech that he uses in the course of writing a poem or composing a poem. And I'll just I took one example, the sheet, and one can give other examples. There's the example of the use of color. He uses color very well. And a thinker doesn't use colors like this, but the mystic poet does. For instance, in one of the poems he says, "Your color is red, and I'm in love with your color." He's a thinker and not a thinker. He's a thinker because he's talking about his feeling of becoming influenced by something, but he doesn't use the word influence. He says, "I like your color. I'm in love with your color. I would like to become totally immersed in this color." This is poetry. And all of us, we will start having a sensation of a different kind. That the person looks at the other figure in terms of the color that the figure has. And that color has colored him entirely. And who is this other figure? You might find out. And when you find out, when you know, and when Kabir tells you that he's talking about God, and he's face to face with God, then there is a sense of elevation. You talk to a great figure, and you are in touch with that figure. And on one side is that great figure, on the other side stand you, the poet, me, the poet, or you as the poet. So nobody has seen God, and even Kabir doesn't see God, but then he can feel the presence, and he's talking to a presence. So if we read his poetry, we also start thinking that we are in that state where the presence is somewhere around us, and we start talking to it. So if you talk to something which the whole world is afraid of, but you are not afraid of. You like him, and you like him, I like him, as one likes one's lover. Then it's a different kind of equation with God. And this makes Kabir a poet. So Kabir can talk to God in a sense as if God is in front of him, and he can relate himself with God. Not only relate with him mentally, he can relate with him at the level of actual color that he's talking about. So red color is very, very fine for Kabir, and red is associated with the sun as it rises in the morning and as it sets in the evening. These are the colors that are there in the sky. So you can go all over the sky and the colors change, and the colors start with the red in the morning and they end with the red in the evening, and there are different shades of red, and Kabir is enjoying the variety of shades of red, and he's using it in his poetry, and it becomes a great poem. And you go into a trance, and you feel as if some power has gone inside you, a current has entered you, and that you are not the same person as you were before this thing happened. So Kabir's poetry is that powerful. He talks about the color, he talks about the sheet. And in the case of the sheet, as I explained to you, he starts believing that his body is like the sheet. And is there a similarity between the body and the sheet? Well, there might be similarities in the sense that the body can be seen as something that protects you. Body protects me. So till I am there inside the body, I feel happy. But if the body leaves me, what happens? Then I am without protection. I am not myself. And in a way, when you start talking like this, when you start thinking like this, that you live in the body, and the body is the sheet, is the cover, and that body is becoming weak with age. For instance, when Kabir is 10, 15 years, then he is full of energy. When he is 40 years, he starts becoming weak at the age of 50 or whatever at that time. Then he starts feeling so weak, as if the body is going to leave him. If the body leaves him, who is he? Maybe something inside the body. He doesn't explain who one is, but he says that I have a body, which means that there are two things that he's thinking of. One is I, the other is the body, and that they are separate. But the connection is that I live in the body, and I live in the body in the same way in which something is wrapped in the sheet. So if the sheet is taken away from the thing, then the thing becomes in its naked form, comes out in the naked form, and then that thing can be seen. But in the case of the human being, the moment one leaves the body, one can't be seen. So just see, all these things start happening when one is reading a poem, and when one reads a poem by Kabir, then one starts thinking about, talking about, and becoming afraid of the very fact of death. It is death which is weakening us. And what is death? Philosophers can say lots of things, but for Kabir, death is just coming to the end of the time that is assigned to you. One is 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, and then the time has come, 100 years have passed, and then one has to leave. And if one has to leave, the one has to leave, the individual has to leave, and that individual cannot exist without the body. So what is the individual? And maybe the same is the case with God. God also cannot be seen. God also may be an individual, and God is a sense, is a form, is a power, is a current, whatever it is. So then maybe Kabir says that at one point of time I'm a small person, and when the body is taken away from me, then I come out of the body and I get absorbed in the bigger thing, which may be God. And that famous line by him that he is a pitcher in the middle of a river. Now just see the picture. In a poem he says he is a pitcher. The pitcher has water inside it. That pitcher is left in the stream of the river, and it's moving this way and that way, but it's generally flowing towards the side to which in the direction in which the water itself is flowing. One day this pitcher will break, and the water inside the pitcher will join the water outside the pitcher. And this is a picture that the individual will die, and that individual, after becoming liberated from the body, will join the bigger picture. So the inner water and the outer water, they become one. So forget about whether it's right or wrong. whether it's actually true or not, start thinking and imagining about it. You know that after death, perhaps we join God. And if we join God, then it's a matter of rejoicing, a matter of celebration. So this is the kind of thing that Kabir is talking about. So he's a poet in that sense. And that very moment, we become fully convinced by the stand that he takes indirectly in the poem. Then he talks about the idea of knowledge. And can you rely on knowledge? Is knowledge dependable? Do you think knowledge is going to stand us in good stead? And where is knowledge and what is knowledge? All these questions. Philosophers have always discussed this question. Today also this question, what is the purpose of education? What is knowledge? Should knowledge be imparted? In what form? What tricks to use? What tactics to adopt? What methods to use? All these things. But then what he thinks about knowledge is also very profound. In one of the poems, he talks about the scholar who reads books and doesn't have knowledge. What does he mean? I read 10 books, I read 20 books, 30 books, I make notes. I also get convinced by this. But Kabir stands in front of me and says, well, you are wasting your time. The knowledge is not there in the book. Then where is the knowledge? You might ask Kabir back, and Kabir would say, well, the knowledge is inside you. It's not in the book. So if the knowledge is inside oneself and not in the book, then what are the scholars doing? Kabir would say they are wasting their time. And if Kabir is saying this, and Kabir is a visionary, Kabir can see things which we can't see, and he can see beyond 20, 30 years, beyond 200 years, 300 years. And if we are today talking about Kabir, and we know that he still has something to give to us, then Kabir is there in front of us, living of course in the 14th century, but talking to us today. So which means Kabir can cross boundaries of time, of centuries, and be available to us today. So this is what knowledge is, and scholars don't know it. Scholars don't have it. So all their life they have wasted in reading books, and they have not reached any conclusion. And Kabir says, I never read a book, but I know what knowledge is. And then he tells his own vision of life, his own vision of God, his own vision of what he considers wrong and right. And that is what makes him a poet. And people feel really impressed by what he says, because he is able to give us that kind of knowledge. Then Kabir is not an ordinary poet by any sense of the term, by any stretch of imagination. A poet today, if you read a poem today, then people will talk of just a flower, just a tree, talk about the life inside the house, life on the streets, life in the market, life in this world. But the sweep is not big. The sweep is that you are only talking about your experiences, and your experiences are the experiences of the workplace, experiences of the place where you live, experiences of the place where you spend your time with your friends. But that experience doesn't go beyond it. And you read Kabir then, and you realize that in the case of Kabir, he says at one place, and see the sweep, he says that let him make all the seven seas, a kind of ink. Let him use all the waters of the seven seas as ink. And then he says, let him make a pen out of all the trees that are there on the earth. Oh, see the sweep. He's thinking of the whole world as all the water as ink, and all the forests as a pen with which he will write. And then he says, even then I can't tell you how greatly I feel when I think about you, what respect I can give. See the sweep. This in English is called hyperbole, but it's not hyperbole because he means it. He says it with such conviction that you start feeling that he's talking about something very big. And then, and he's talking this about teacher, and a teacher who is not a scholar. So imagine that he holds the place of the teacher as high as that he cannot praise me enough, even though he had the entire, sea, water of the sea as ink, and all the forest as the source of pen. So this is the kind of thing that he can say, and he can get away with it because he is able to, talk in terms of the cosmos, in terms of big things. He can talk about the sky, the stars, he can talk about the sun, and he can bring them in his poetry, and then he can use them to good effect by such a thing as this. In another of his poems, he talks about the leaf leaving the branch. Now, it's a very ordinary thing. All of us, see that leaves fall from the branch and they come onto the ground and they are dry, and the wind is blowing at that time, and this wind will sweep the leaf away. This is a normal thing. When in the morning, the sweeper comes and he sees that lots of leaves have fallen on the road or on the path. Then the first thing the sweeper does is to just sweep it away, sweep it off. Kabir also sees this phenomena in the 14th century. He must have seen the sweeper at work at that point of time, but then he saw something else in this act. He says that our own life is like that of a leaf, and we are stuck to the society in which we live. And one day what's going to happen is like the leaf will fall off, and the branch and the tree is the society. After that, shall we come back to this world? Now, nobody can answer this question. I can't answer this question. Perhaps you also cannot answer this question, that when one dies, will one come back to this world? But then he raises this question. He doesn't answer it. And he, of course, answers it in a different sense as a mystic. But then he merely says, the leaf leaves the branch, falls down, and then it will never get back to the branch. And that is all. And he says it, in 2 lines. So imagine a poet can talk about life and death with such a powerful metaphor as this. And this is a language that all of us understand. So I've given you an idea of what kind of poetry he writes and what kind of a poet is he. And now I'll, from here, briefly tell you about certain other things, that I want to share with you. Viewers, would you agree that Kabir is a great teacher? Because somebody calls him a great teacher. There is a person called R.P. Tiwari. I read his essay, and he says that Kabir is a great teacher. My answer would be yes and no. Yes, because he tells about things which we don't know, we have not heard, we have not felt with our own effort. Our effort has always been wanting. We can't understand what is going on around us in their connection. We might see a particular thing at a particular time and we know that it's wrong or right, and that is all about it. But if one is a poet, if one is a person with great intellect and imagination, one can say, well, I saw this in the morning, another thing in the afternoon, a third thing in the evening, and the 3 are connected. And then you go back to yesterday. Yesterday they were not there, today they are there, tomorrow, and then he extends further. Tomorrow they may or may not be there. So just see, that these things the poet will make you aware of. And if he's making you aware of and you're listening, and you respect, you listen to him with respect, and you have trust in him, then he's of course a teacher. So Kabir criticizes teaching. Kabir distrusts teaching. Kabir thinks that the teachers or the philosophers' life, because one reads books, is useless, is futile. It's a futile effort that people do. And then, when Kabir reads a poem or sings a poem, or another person takes his poem and starts singing it, then one becomes a transformed person. One starts looking at oneself in a different light, and one learns a lesson and becomes different oneself. So in that sense, Kabir is a poet. So Kabir, will always, if you read Kabir, if I read Kabir, he will take me always out of traditional, structure. I would not look at life traditionally then, in terms of a dogma, that I blindly follow what is given to me, but I would like to examine it. So in that sense, he's a great teacher, and he has taught, not just in his own time, not in the following centuries, just 1 or 2, but he teaches us even today to have that kind of self-assurance, that makes an individual an individual. Secondly, is he a religious reformer? He is called a religious reformer also. Once again, my answer would be yes and no. Reform in the sense, that he asks us to reinterpret religion. And if there is a question of faith, then he would say, okay, have this faith, but have it conscious faith, not blind faith. Suppose he says this, then he offers for our benefit a kind of a critique, a kind of an attack on, a kind of a criticism of the existing available religions in the world. So this religion or that religion, there are five or six religions in the world today, and all these religions have this particular idea of faith. But then, apart from the faith, one should also be allowed to seriously question the very act of faith, and this is what Kabir does. So therefore he says, okay, I am not against religion as such, but your religion should be your conscious religion. It should not be a religion that you blindly accept. So in that sense, he is a religious reformer, but one doesn't know whether this question has to be understood, as totally right or wrong. Now, from discussing his poems and discussing his attitude, I'll just take a few minutes to make one or two points regarding his life. What is it in his life that made him this kind of a poet? And one answer is, and I was reading a book, by a young poet today called Vinay Dharwarkar. He's written a whole, book. It's a 100-page introduction plus, songs of Kabir translated into English, and the book is available today. It's called Kabir, the Weaver's Songs. And in this book, this thing is mentioned, and I was struck by this idea. The person who introduced Vinay Dharwarkar, he said, Kabir was a cotton weaver. In all likelihood, then, he belonged to a class of artisans. He is a cotton weaver by profession, and he is Julaha of cotton weaver. And who is a Julaha? Who is a cotton weaver? A cotton weaver is a person who, according to Dharwarkar, is a class of artisans, and at the bottom of the economic scale. Nobody can be poorer than that. This person doesn't have anything of his own. He just has a little of machine at his place, and it's a very elementary kind of a machine, and he gets his cotton, and then he cleans it, and he softens it, and then he puts it there on the kargha, on the weaving thing, on the weaving machine, and then he makes thread out of it, and then he gets his livelihood out of it. So Kabir, that way, rightly is told as belonging to the bottom of the economic scale. He is the poorest of the poor in the 14th century. He is living as a poor person. How does he see all these things? Please ask this question from yourself. I should ask this question from myself. How is it that such a poor person who doesn't have any facility available to him to breathe a life of ease and comfort, this person can write this kind of poetry that we are today discussing it? The question is worth asking, and one answer can be that the way the poor can see the world, the rich cannot see. Because the poor sees it from that angle where the whole thing appears so very cruel, so very bad, so very negative. The poor person doesn't get any comfort in life, and this person has no notion about greatness and ideal things, because he has not seen the ideal. He has not seen any greatness. In fact, as a poor person, one has seen pettiness only among the rich, and rich don't even know that they are petty. Nobody has the courage, in fact, in society to tell the rich people that they are petty, they are small, they are self-centered, and they are mean people, mean fellows. Nobody tells them. But a person who is poor, a person who is at a distance from the rich and powerful in society, the kings and queens of his time, this person can say that these people at the top actually are the worst of the lot. So the person at the bottom of the economic scale, as said here, are able to see things from an angle which is very realistic, and it is this which makes Kabir a great poet, because from there he can see the truth in its naked form. Then the other point that is made there is Kabir's personal life, the social consequences of poverty. He is a very poor person, would have been quite unambiguous. If you are poor, you are poor. And Kabir is a poor person, and as a poor person he doesn't have any love for the riches, because the riches are not his. He has never experienced, he has never taken any happiness out of the riches, because he never got them. So as an artisan in the urban underclass of 15th century Banaras, and underclass is using the word, the lowest class, there he lives, and if he lives there, then of course one knows that life there is not worth living. So he lives in Banaras in the 15th century, because as I said, he died in 1448. So for the first 48 years, he was there in Banaras at that time. If that is true, then he lived as a poor person, and since he lived as a poor person, therefore he could see all those things in a different light. Then the third thing that is said about him is his uncompromising attitude towards theological and social criticism. He is uncompromising. He doesn't accept honestly, clearly, with courage. He says things which very few people can. Even today, if a person is like Kabir and is presenting those things, then one can say that one can only have the option to feel disturbed but not say anything. So he is that kind of criticism of society and life that he is able to give for the benefit of the people. At the heart of Kabir's ways of thinking and speaking is the conviction, and this is the conviction, is that God is absolutely without attributes or qualities. What is God? Who is God? Or what does God look like? Ask Kabir, and Kabir's answer is that God doesn't have any attributes. Attributes means qualities, features, characteristics. You can't say, well, this is what God is, because the moment you say this, then you are thinking in other terms. You are thinking in your own terms. This is how you look at yourself. But then God, for him, is an idea, and that idea enlightens his life and the life of others. That is what God is. But God is not a human being. God is not that kind of a figure that can be easily identified or imagined. And therefore, for him, God is that kind of an idea which makes you aware about your own self, your own greatness, your own weaknesses, and you have been all the time thinking. I have all the time been thinking, that if there is more money and if there is more power with me, I will be happy. But then Kabir will tell you that all this happiness, all this power that you think is right, is there, actually is an illusion. It's a maya. It's not there. And he gives the example that this maya will remain only till the time you are alive. But the moment you are dead, this thing will be taken away from you. So it is there with you, or for me, as long as one lives. So why have such a thing which doesn't get carried by you beyond your time? And therefore he says that all this is illusion. And therefore his God is not Sagun God. It's not the God that can be imagined. It's a God that can be felt, that can be understood but not imagined. So it's a Nirgun God. It's not a Sagun God so far as Kabir is concerned. And finally, he talks about the world that he lives in such terms as, these. He's talking about the world. I'll be concluding with this idea. He's talking about the world in which we live. We means not today. He would not talk about the 21st century. He was there in the 15th century. But about the 15th century, what he says is what is true even about the 21st century in which we live. And he tells this about the 15th century. He says their egotism, they have an ego, and they are completely confined to themselves. And they believe that they are right. They believe that what they do, or the way they conduct themselves, is the right way. But that is their egotism, because somebody else next to them is doing the opposite. And that person also has egotism. So who is right? You who have one kind of view, or the other person who has another kind of view, and both of you think individually that you are right. So he says, this is not right or wrong, this is your egotism. You are all the time in love with yourself. And then he says greed. How is greed so great? Greed is not great. Greed is the worst thing that is possible in a person's conduct and character. But if you are greedy, if you keep things to yourself, if you don't share them with others, if you collect them with your own self and let them rot in your house, then that is what greed is. And pretentiousness, thinking very high when one is very low, that is pretentiousness. You pretend to be very great, but actually you know that you are not great at all. Among other qualities, lead human beings to perpetrate acts of deception upon themselves. So you start saying wrong things, you start believing in them, and because you believe in them, therefore your life will be affected by them. This is something that is there in the world today. Today means in his 15th century world. And people deceive themselves and they deceive others. So it's a deception upon themselves and upon each other, which adds a profusion of man-made delusion. So things will finally become very big. All of us, have our own deceptions, our own weaknesses, our own artificialities. And when they collect, then that becomes our world. If that is the case, then already we have strengthened the cause of Maya. So this is what Kabir says, and I'll conclude with this, that so far as Kabir is concerned, this world is nothing but artificiality. It is only Maya, and we can understand it only when we understand the idea of God as that God which tells us as to who we are, what we are. And if we are aware about ourselves, if we are aware about our conduct and its limitations, then only we can understand Kabir's message at that he gave at that time. So finally, I would say that Kabir was using a language which was direct and simple. Kabir was using his metaphors in such a manner that everybody could really grasp them. And he was critiquing things because they were bad, and we also find them bad. We generally don't think they are bad, but when he shows us the things in a mirror of his poetry, then we realize that he's right, and that's why we believe in him and discuss with him with passion, with interest, with engagement, even today. So this is what I had to give, and I'm sure you would have some questions to ask yourselves later, and you will be discussing with your friends and others. So till that time, goodbye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session once again. And dear friends, as Professor Anand Prakash himself said, that yes, you can send your questions to us. We'll try to give answers to your questions when next time Professor Prakash visits our studio. For giving your feedback, you need to write our email ID. Our ID is info.cec@nic.in. Your feedbacks, your suggestions and your questions are all welcome. The lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube soon. So keep watching us, keep writing us. We would be meeting and would be talking more and more under the series. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.